It is technology. It's meant to break down.
Yeah, exactly. Come on. There we go. Yes, I'm aware of that. Aware of that. All right. Now, can someone online please confirm that you can see my PowerPoint?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, thanks.
Not a problem.
All right. With less than a minute to go, and since we're recording anyway, I'll at least go ahead and start with the announcements. It's not technically class. So to remind you, you need to email me for attendance, even if you're present, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Email me for attendance. Also, to remind you, lab is due tonight, anytime before midnight. It's posted on Google Classroom. This is the first week, so I understand if it's hard to find, much less hard to, much less do it. So if you need help finding it or if you need help doing it, meet me online for office hours after class, from 9 to 10:40, and I can show you my screen and walk you through it, show you how to do it. Really quick on independent work, just to clear it up. Technically, you should have 10 points by the end of this week. So before Monday starts, you should have 10 points. And what that means is that's all for grading purposes. So if you don't have 10 points, like if you've only got 8 points or 5 points, you're not necessarily going to get penalized. It's just that, like, if next week you ask me what your grade is, and that's the only thing you've been graded on, if you haven't turned anything in, then your grade's going to be a big F, right? Just because I've got to base it on something. The only thing that's really dead set on is, I think, March 22nd, the due date. 10 weeks, right? So at that point, that is a due date. You can't turn anything in after that. So yeah, that's it for independent work. So make sure you start turning stuff in. Again, with anything, just like anything else, if you have questions on how to do it or need some inspiration on what to do, meet me online during office hours and we can talk. And then one last thing on that, somebody talked about summarizing an article, which is a great idea. I'd love for you guys to do that. And I posted an example of how I want you to summarize, but I posted it last semester. So I'm going to find it and repost it for you guys. Basically what I want from you to, and I can't force you to do this because I have no way of knowing if you did it, but what I want you to do when you summarize an article is, like, read it once, twice, however many times you want, and then get rid of it and summarize it from memory, right? Just summarize what you remember, even if you barely remember anything, and you write something like, all right, I read this article about megalodons, and these scientists from some university in Australia were studying them, and they think that megalodons are actually around before we thought they were, right? And that could be your paper. That's not much information, but that's okay, because I want to train you guys to be able to read something and remember it and describe it. And the more you do that, the better you're going to be at it. And that's going to help you not just for independent work, but it's going to help you with every class you take, because that's how you learn. And that's also going to help you if you take the GRE, so for those of you who want to go to grad school. And that'll just help you as a critically thinking citizen of the United States or citizen of the world, right? To be able to read something and remember it and then be able to describe it to somebody. It's a very important skill to have. So please do that. I'll try to find the example and share it with you. So I'm done with the soapbox junk. I'm going to go ahead and get started unless anybody has questions. No questions? All right. So last thing we talked about, well, first of all, before we review, can anybody tell me, if you remember, what is the definition of biology? What is biology? Very close. Yes, the scientific study of life. And don't feel bad if you say the study of life, because my whole life growing up, that's what I was always told. Biology is the study of life. But I love that your textbook specifically says the scientific study of life. So anyway, the reason I brought that back up is because that's what we talked about on Wednesday. We said, all right, if biology is the scientific study of life, then what is science? And mostly what we talked about, the most important thing you can get from this bullet point, if you want to go back and study it, is you need to know the scientific process, right? Observation, which leads to questions, which leads to a hypothesis, which leads to predictions, and then you do an experiment, and that's it. And also, and I don't remember if I pointed this out on Wednesday, again, I test out of the textbook, right? This is a 100 level class, so your textbook is the ultimate authority. So if you were to Google the scientific process, you're going to get all kinds of different answers. They all follow the same basic principles, but they're not all exactly the same. which makes sense because the scientific property or the scientific method isn't something set in stone. It's just a general guideline. So are there any questions about that before we jump into what it means to be alive? Since we've already talked about scientific, so what is life? All right, the properties of life. What is life? That's the question that we're trying to answer right now. What distinguishes living from non-living? I think, especially now, when you think about all the technology we have, if you think about robots that can move, and then you have AI, right? So they can think too. What makes something alive? Your book points out that life itself, it defies a simple one-sentence definition, right? If I were to challenge you right now to write the definition of life, it's not very easy to do. Basically, the way we define life is we talk about what living things do. So before we get into it, does anybody guess what makes something alive? Obviously, your one guess isn't going to be a completely correct answer because you need all of it together. Because I'll give you one of them. One of the things living things do is move. Or excuse me, I don't want to say that. Reproduce, right? Living things reproduce. But that in itself doesn't necessarily mean that you're alive, because I'm sure there's machines out there that make other machines, right? So technically that's reproduction. So any other guesses of things that make something alive? If you were on a foreign planet and you found something and you're like, okay, I think this thing is alive. Any guesses?
It has to grow.
Grow? That's a great one. Yeah. For the most part, well, yeah, that is a great one. And we'll talk more about that one. Yeah. And of course, it's also important to point out that sometimes non-living things grow, sometimes very slowly. Like if you've ever been to a cave and saw a stalactite or a stalagmite, those things hanging from the ceilings or coming up from the floor, those also technically grow. Not biologically, but they do get bigger, right? So what else? Growth is a good one. What else? Don't be shy. There's definitely nothing wrong with a wrong answer. I love wrong answers more than I love correct answers, because then I know what you're thinking and we can correct your thinking.
Things that are alive need to eat.
They need to eat. That's a great one. There's a different, better way of saying that. We'll talk about it. But basically, you need energy, right? You have to take in some energy. Things that are living need to take in energy. Then again, I should point out also, so do non-living things, right? Your vehicle is not going to work unless you put in gasoline or electricity, depending on what you drive. Good. Anything else?
Movement.
Movement's a great one. A lot of people think that. But technically, there are some things that are alive that just can't move, especially if it's single-celled. You know, some single-celled things do have the ability to move. And you know what? Sometimes if you were to Google this, that might be one of the answers you get. So according to your textbook, movement is not one of the answers. I kind of agree with them. But that's not too far off. But great guess. So we'll quit guessing. We'll move forward. Here it is. This is on your textbook. I forget which page it is. But we'll talk about each one of them individually. Order. Order is apparent in many of the turtle. Well, they're using turtles as an example. So let's just run with that. Order is apparent in many of the turtle structures, such as the regular arrangement of plates in the turtle shell. So if you were to look at any cell, and I'm getting away from the turtle example, if you look at any cell on Earth that's alive, there is order, right? There's going to be certain parts that are exactly the same and have the same process, the same shape, and the same function, found in the generally the same area, and that is order. And we'll talk about that later in the semester. So remember that. This is something you need to know for the exam. Order is the first one. Being made of cells is the other one. To me, those are very similar. Because like I said, I use the example of, if you look at the cellular level, all cells on Earth have certain things that are the same, but also the fact that it's made of cells. So this is a great time to remind you that viruses are not alive. And that's one of the reasons why viruses are not alive. So COVID-19, or the virus that causes COVID-19, is not alive because it's not made of cells. It uses cells to do its bad deeds, but it itself is not a cell, so it is not alive. Growth and development. So someone already said that. And again, using the sea turtle as an example, the sea turtle matures into an adult sea turtle, and it takes decades to do that. But yes, everything grows and develops. Even single-celled organisms. I mean, obviously, they're not getting that much bigger because they're only one cell, but they are growing or at least developing. So the things inside of them or at least multiplying, right? So they do grow and they do develop. Less obviously, but they do it. The other one is evolution. Life evolves, right? From generation to generation, things change. Also, sometimes non-living things evolve. For example, the virus that causes COVID-19. If you've been paying attention to the news, you know that there's at least 2 strands that we've identified because the original one mutated. That in itself is evolution. And we'll talk more about viruses and evolution later in the semester. The next one is reproduction. Again, every living thing can reproduce. There's not much to say about that one. That was probably one of the easier ones. It's easy to remember and easy to understand. I don't think I need to explain to you what reproduction is. I will point out, though, that, again, viruses are not alive. That's one of the reasons they're not alive is because they cannot reproduce, not on their own. The last one, another one is response to the environment. You were talking about the sea turtle. It says the sex of the sea turtle hatchlings varies in response to the environment. Basically what they say, and this is the case with a lot of reptiles, is the temperature in which the eggs are in dictate what sex they're going to be born as. That's just one example. There's a lot of examples of how things respond to the environment. For example, if I were to turn the heat way up in here, people that are in here might sweat, right? You get hot. That's a response to the environment. Energy processing. So like the gentleman in person said earlier, eating. So it's not always eating, right? Because not everything technically eats, but still, that's the same thing. Energy processing. We have to take in energy, and we need energy. Like, for example, how many of you, when you get tired, go out naked and get some sun, and that makes you feel better? It doesn't work that way. You might get a little bit of adrenaline rush from being naked outside, but it doesn't work that way, right? So the solar energy needs to be processed by plants to make that into sugar energy, and then we need to eat that sugar energy and then to process that into another type of energy, and that's also some of the stuff we're going to talk about in the semester. And then finally, regulation. To me, regulation is a lot like response to the environment. But for example, I'll use a human example. You know, your blood pH is probably around 7.4, and if you were to drink, you know, a bunch of margaritas with a whole lot of lime juice, which is very acidic, your blood pH would still be 7.4 because your body regulates itself, right? It doesn't want to be. It cannot be anything too high or too low. So it has ways of making sure that your blood pH stays at 7.4. So anyway, for the exam, you need to know all of those. It's a multiple choice exam, so the good news is I won't have one question where I say, what are all the properties of life? But I might have one where I list a bunch of stuff and you have to choose the one that's wrong or something like that. Also, so you know, this is basically what the whole semester is about. Like I said, what we're going to learn in biology is the things that make you alive, right? And these are the things that make you alive. So everything up until the end maybe is this, all right? All we're going to learn about is how we regulate, how we process energy, how we grow and develop. We're going to learn what the order is of our cells. We're going to learn about evolution. We're going to learn about reproduction, right? All these things are what you're going to learn. And if you want, this is also a good idea for independent work. If you want to choose a certain thing that's alive and give examples of all these things, like, all right, maybe you want to do sharks. We talk about sharks a lot, so I'm just sticking with it. You can talk about the order of sharks. You can talk about their cells. You can talk about how sharks grow and develop, how they process energy, so on and so forth. So are there any questions about these things that make us alive, these properties of life? Okay. A good test question would be something hypothetical. Like I said, you're on a foreign planet and you find this thing and you take it to the laboratory and it does this, 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 and this, and this. So how do you know it's alive? And by reading that, you can say, oh yeah, well, he did describe regulation and he did describe growth and development, right? So those are the kind of things you look for. All right. If there's no questions, we can go on to the third bullet point, which are the major themes in biology. I'm going to go through this one pretty quickly because this is going to be, there's going to be very little bit of this on the exam. This is a lot of a preview of what the semester is going to be. So each one of these little bullet points is something we will talk about in each chapter. So that's why I'm going to go through it so quickly. All right. Again, like I kind of just said, the following slides highlight 5 unifying themes recurring throughout our investigation of biology. I will not ask you anything about these 5 unifying themes. You'll just get very familiar with them by the end of the semester because we'll keep talking about them over and over and over. But the first one is the relationship of structure to function. And I think this is a book example when we're talking about your lungs. If you see things at different levels within biological systems, you can see that they all have structure and function. Can anybody tell what that is? Yeah, that's your lungs. Specifically, those are the blood vessels in your lungs. So that's not all the other good stuff, just the blood vessels. Anybody know what those are? Yeah, blood cells, red blood cells. And they all have structure and function. And what is the function of lungs or even red blood cells? If you had to put it very basically without getting specific, because we're talking about 2 different things, but what basically do they need to do?
Process oxygen.
Yeah, that's very specific. We could even get a little bit more broad. He said process oxygen, and they do need to do that. But back it up just a little bit more. What's an even more broad thing you could say? Because it also includes the opposite of what you said, in a way. What is it? Breathe, yeah. That's another way of saying it. Basically, what I'm getting at is they need to exchange gases, right? They need oxygen coming in. They need carbon dioxide going out. So because of that, you want a big surface area. And that's why red blood cells look like little donut type things, because they're big and flat and they have a large surface area. And they're skinny, right? So that allows oxygen to come in easily and carbon dioxide to leave easily. If it was a big blobous spherical cell, it would be a lot harder to do that. Same thing with these lungs. You don't just have one big blood vessel. Your lungs aren't just one big empty sac. There's a lot of surface area because their purpose is to do the same thing. Oxygen out, carbon dioxide coming in. So that's just an example of structure to function. Like I said, we're going to talk about this throughout the semester. And because that's just an example, there'll be no questions about it on the exam. I'm not going to ask you what the function of a red blood cell is or lungs or anything like that. Just an example. The next one is information flow. We'll have many chapters that basically cover just that idea. But all levels of organization in biology, and when I say all levels of organization, I'll remind you what that last slide said. So whether or not we're talking about molecules or organelles or cells or tissues or organs or organ systems or organisms or even whole ecosystems, whatever it is, there's going to be information flow. So information about your book gives this example. This is just an example. Information about glucose in your bloodstream is received by organs such as the pancreas. Pancreas gets that information and it says, oh, okay, here's some insulin. And that regulates your level of glucose in your blood. So that's just one example of information flow. The ones we're going to talk about more are genetics. So we'll talk about how information comes in and then that triggers some things in your DNA. And again, we'll talk about that later in the semester. We'll also talk about pathways that transform energy and matter. There's going to be one whole exam devoted to this. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 is all about processing energy. Life requires energy. Like I said, chapter 5, that's basically what chapter 5 says. Is like, hey, if things are alive, they need energy because they've got to do these things that require energy. Like I mentioned earlier, most ecosystems are solar powered. If you're taking notes, you don't necessarily need to write that down. That'll be something we cover in detail later. The study guide for chapter 1 asks you questions about things on this slide, but they won't be on the exam. So because of that, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because, again, we're going to talk about this in chapters 5, 6, and 7. But sunlight, as you all know, I'm sure you've heard of the word photosynthesis. That energy is captured by plants and other photosynthetic organisms. They turn that into molecules that store energy. We call that food. We eat the food. We break down those molecules and release that energy that was stored in the molecules. And then, because we can't even use that energy directly anyway, we have to transfer that into a different type of molecular energy. And then when we need energy, we take it from that particular molecule. So these are all things we'll talk about later. This too, energy, when you go from one form to another, you lose some of the energy as heat. And that'll be a very important concept later in the semester, but not now. It's too early to really get into that. So any questions about this slide? Again, not on this exam. We're going to have many chapters where we cover this and go into detail. So that's why I'm covering it quickly. I'm only even covering it because it's in your book. And like I said, I teach from the book. So if you're following along, I don't want you to be like, oh, why the hell did he skip this? The reason is because I want to show you that I recognize that it's there and tell you that you're not going to be tested on this. And there's a picture of what we're talking about, right? Energy comes in from the sunlight. It gets cycled around in an ecosystem. As it's cycled around, each time it gets switched from one form to another, it gets lost as heat. All right, interactions within biological systems. And again, like I said, when I talk about biological systems, what I mean is like from the very smallest level, when we could be talking about an atom and then a molecule, and then maybe a larger molecule, and then maybe an organelle, and then a cell, and so on and so forth, right? That's what I mean by systems. And there'll be a picture I'll show you here in a second that really demonstrates it. But what we mean is not only so think about a cell, right? Things within inside of a cell are interacting with each other, right? So if you look at that system, a cellular system, you know that there's things interacting in that system. And then you go up to the next level and you have things called tissues, right? A bunch of cells make up tissues. So not only are the cells interacting with themselves, but then you have cellular interaction with tissue interaction. So that makes it more complex. And then a bunch of tissues can make up organs, right? So now you have all those things interacting with each other. All this to say basically is that you get to the smallest level, which are molecular atoms, that itself is complicated. But then when you get to the biggest level, which is the entire biosphere, right, which is all living things interacting together, each time you step up, it just gets more complicated and complicated. And again, that should just make common sense because these molecules and atoms are interacting with each other. That's that system. And then you move up to organelles, right? And then, yes, these things are still interacting with each other, but then they are also interacting with them. And those are also interacting with those, and so on and so forth. All that to say, biology is actually quite complex. And the good news is, even though it does get more and more complex, we generally, in this class, do not get more and more complex. In some ways we do. In some ways, this is a comprehensive class because, for example, the next chapter we talk about will be chapter 2, where we talk about chemistry. And you can't truly understand the rest of the chapters unless you get chemistry, right? So in a sense, it is comprehensive that way. So any questions about this slide or anything I just said? We're making good time. All right, so that brings us to the last bullet point, evolution. And again, there's going to be a whole chapter on this. So everything I'm about to tell you is just a preview and something for you to keep in the back of your head as we go throughout the semester. But nothing I'm about to tell you is going to be on this exam. So if you're taking notes, you just give your hand a rest. Life, again, we're studying life, right? We're scientifically studying life. Life is distinguished by its unity and its diversity, which might sound weird. What I mean by that is, like I said earlier, if you were to look at every single cell on Earth, whether it's a bacteria or a penguin or a human or a snake or a plant, whatever, every single cell on Earth has certain things that are unique or that are identical, right? Some of these things are existing in all living forms. That's the unity. And then, of course, the diversity, that's very easy to see, right? Humans look a lot different than koalas. Of course, if you consider a banana, humans actually look a lot like koalas because we look nothing like bananas. Koalas have heads and arms and feet and torsos, right? But that's unity and diversity. Evidence points to life's unity, similarities among individuals. We can also see fossil things and say, oh man, look, things, not only are everything alive similar in some ways, but they're also similar to things that no longer exist that used to be alive. Some examples are common cellular processes. So we all need to process energy, things like that. The universal chemical structure of DNA. So we'll talk at least 2 chapters on that. DNA is DNA is DNA. No matter what organism you are, you all have A's, C's, T's, and G's for your DNA. And again, we'll talk about that later in the semester. So the explanation for all this unity and all this diversity is evolution. And evolution is defined, at least in this chapter and in this book, as the process of change that's transformed life from the earliest forms to the vast array of organisms living today. And again, if you're taking notes, there's no need to write that down. This will not be on the first exam. And also, I don't even like that definition of evolution. That's more like, what is evolution in the context of this slide, right? Evolution is actually, in my opinion, a little bit different. But are there any questions about evolution? So your book Hold on. Yeah. So your book also talks, when we talk about evolution, you talk a lot about Charles Darwin. And your book, even in chapter 1, talks about Charles Darwin. Read it. It's okay if you want. But none of that will be on this exam. We're going to learn about evolution later. For now, it's just an introduction. Every chapter in your book ends with this, the evolution connection, right? So there's all these themes in every chapter. And if you notice, the theme in this chapter was turtles. So in every chapter, there's going to be a theme. Every chapter will have this at the end, evolution connection. And in every chapter, I'm going to skip it because time is of the essence. So I'm not going to test you on this stuff. I do recommend reading it. Questions about this will be on the study guide. So it'll help you a little bit. You can get a few points by knowing this. But yeah, don't worry about it for the exam. And that's it. Any questions about anything? Because we're well ahead of schedule all of a sudden. Because it's 8:25 and we are done for the week. I don't want to jump into chapter 2 because I want you to think about chapter 1 over the weekend. So no questions? All right, I guess we're done. I'll be online for office hours from 9 to 10:40. So if you have questions about anything like independent work or lab specifically, just come online and find me. So I will see you all on Monday. Have a good
I
weekend.
have a quick question.
Oh, yes.
It's just about like the work and stuff. So basically all the points we'll be getting is just through exams and the labs, right?
Good question. And I'll answer it. But also, if you can look at the video that I made for the syllabus, or I also explained it there. But you get 1,000 points total. Half of them come from tests. The other half come from, you get points for attendance. You get points for that independent work, which is, written work and things like that. And you get points for lab. So, yeah, basically half of your points are coming from what you know and what you remembered. And the other half is coming from being present and doing work.
Okay. So it's one lab a week, right?
Yes. Every Monday I will share the lab with you. Because if you look on Google Classroom, you'll notice that all the labs are already there and listed. And they have either no due dates or very weird due dates. You don't need to worry about that. Every Monday, I'll share something with you and say, this is the lab for this week.
Okay.
Great question. And that's
I have
good.
a question.
Yes.
Monday is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and we're not supposed to have classes. Are we still meeting?
Nope. Thank you for reminding me.
Okay.
I'll send that off as a reminder. When I post this video, I'll remind everybody. I'm glad you reminded me. I would have been mad if I came in here and been all by myself.
All right.
Any other questions? These are great questions.
I actually have one question.
Yeah.
It's about the lab. So I did completed the lab, but I noticed that my numbers were extremely fluctuated and like a lot higher than the average. I was just wanting to know, is that normal? Like,
yeah. I hate to say it because other people are listening and they may not have done the lab yet, but yes, I kind of did that on purpose.
okay.
Some on were too, like I had like 80 breaths.
Right, me too.
So you probably followed the directions I gave in the video, right?
Yeah.
Yep. I did that on purpose. And you'll see why, but at the end, once you've done the lab, and I'll give you the response and the feedback. The idea there is I wanted you to mess up so I could say, hey, look at your data versus everyone else's data. It's a lot different. Obviously, in this case, it's not your fault. It's because I told you to do that. But in a real life situation, whether you're doing an experiment or you're reading a study, which is more likely for you guys since you're non-biology majors, but if you're reading a study and you're looking at data and then they're like one piece of data really sticks out as wrong, that should be an indication that that experiment is wrong. Somebody messed something up. And in this case, you guys did mess something up, but it's not your fault because I made you mess it up. But yeah, great question.
So much.
So I had my online version of the lab. It was like some PDF document. Is that the same?
Good question. Don't do anything on my online. I don't know. There was some kind of glitch there. Everything should be on Google Classroom.
Okay.
So great question. Any other questions? All right, that was helpful. In that case, I'll quit recording and I'll be back online at 9 a.m. All right.